footsteps of King Cambyses' lost army, the expedition must first visit Karga, which the historian Herodotus called Oasis. It was the last place where he said they were seen alive.
The force which was sent against the Ammonians started from Thebes and may be traced as far as the town of Oasis, 7 days' journey across the sand.
The approach is still dominated by a mud brick fortress that was already ancient when the Persian invaders appeared out of the desert.
Well, the fort was certainly here in Persian times, so therefore it's quite likely that it was garrisoned. So perhaps the first thing that the Persians had to do as they burst into Karga Oasis was reduce this fort. It's certainly a certainly commanding view of the entire oasis and a commanding position.
Herodotus states that the army took a week to cover the 130 miles from the Nile Valley to Karga. If they managed to keep up this rate of 18 miles a day, on foot, without any shade, in blistering temperatures, it would have taken them more than 3 weeks to cross the desert to Siwa. And that's assuming they marched in a dead straight line. In fact, Tom is sure that the need to find water would have made the journey even longer.
So the Persians started here in Luxor and crossed 130 miles of open desert to get here to Karga Oasis. And their general track, regardless of how they went, was to the northwest. Siwa would be clear off the map way up here, 405 miles away. So what they would do, almost certainly, would be to go to the last water before the open desert. And the last water before the open desert, in any direction that they would take from here, would be Ain Amur.
The tiny oasis of Ain Amur is an easy drive away, but for the Persian foot soldiers, the slog through the unforgiving desert would have been a taste of things to come.
When they started out, they might have been fairly cocky because they had a force that they knew would be able to overthrow any tiny oasis village, of which they must have captured hundreds in the establishment of the Persian Empire. And so this would be nothing more than a raid or a routine mission for them. But they had no idea what they were up against and what they were going to face.
The western desert of Egypt is dry even by the standards of the Sahara. In summer, temperatures can soar above 50 degrees centigrade. This is no place to be far from home.
After 3 days on the march, the Persians would have been exhausted. I'm sure that even between Karga Oasis and this point, the water was already being rationed. They're beginning to realize that water is running out. A few palm trees in a hole with some water in it. It must have looked very, very good to thirsty soldiers having marched the 80 kilometers from Karga.
If the Persian army did stop at Ain Amur, there's every chance they'd have left something behind.
We've collected a number of pottery sherds laying around on the surface of the landscape around the oasis. And these represent different types of cooking pots, water jars, carrying vessels for food, stone in some cases, painted pottery, glazed pottery. And these represent different periods from the Pharaonic really through to contemporary times to modern day. It's very hard to say if they stayed here. I mean, they may have just watered, not even camped overnight, or if they did, you'd probably need to excavate this area to be able to tell for sure.
Tom has worked out the logistics of the army's stay here.
To be a viable source of water for such a large force, I believe that the spring must have been larger to really attract them, unless they were prepared to stay here for several days and make the best use of the water supply they could, fill everything up to the outset, give everyone a good rest, let everybody tank up on water before the march started again. If they did stop at this watering hole, it may well have been the last water that the Persians saw at all.
From Ain Amur onwards, all food and water has to be transported. For the Persians, this must have been a huge burden. The logistics make it virtually certain that Cambyses' army could not have been as vast as Herodotus said.
50,000 is a great many people to take on what in effect was desert travel from one oasis to another, because apart from watering the soldiers, you've got to water all the pack animals as well.
With decades of experience in the desert, Tom Barn has calculated that a minimum of 3,000 tons of food and water would have been needed for 50,000 men to survive the march to Siwa.
As with most such figures that we get in ancient sources, we have to be fairly sceptical. It's often said that one should take off a 0 or 2 before one actually gets to the accurate figure, and that's particularly true of Persian armies, which are always exaggerated in terms of their size. It's said in other cases that millions of men took part in Persian expeditions.
The army was probably at the most 5,000 strong. Tom Barn has a new theory which has the soldiers running out of luck and water in a place where no one has looked before. He believes the Persians' lack of understanding of the local geography led them far to the south of their intended destination, directly into the Great Sand Sea.
I suspect that the Persian army setting out into the desert would not really have known what was there. They were at the far extreme of their empire here. They didn't have a very developed sense of space, they didn't have three-dimensional maps, and I think they probably would have had little idea of what they were finding at the other end.
The Great Sand Sea stretches over 100,000 square miles, with dunes up to 500 feet high. It's one of the least known and most treacherous places on Earth. One of the few to have experienced it is oil prospector Mike Rondell.
It's like being in a raging ocean. There is no way out. There's no civilization. There's absolutely no way to call. And if you're stuck, you don't survive. It's as simple as that. You can survive for 2 days or 3 days, and then you don't. That's it. You're finished.
Gerhard Rolfs in 1874 was the first Western explorer to survive the journey through the dune field. By the 1930s, motor cars were making the first tentative forays into the Great Sand Sea. The most celebrated of the explorers was the real English patient, Count Laszlo al-Nashi.
He went through the Great Sand Sea, I think 3 or 4 times, and he knew the Libyan desert and the Sahara, parts of the Sahara, and the Egyptian desert, I mean, probably better than anybody. The Arabs, they called him the father of the sands.
Many of the driving techniques still used by desert drivers today were pioneered by al-Nashi, such as reducing tire pressure to increase traction in the soft sand. In the flat corridors between the dunes, high speeds could be achieved, but crossing the soft sand of the dunes themselves created huge problems for even the most expert drivers. In the 1930s, Rupert Harding Newman was one of them.
On one appalling occasion in 1935, when we got into a belt of dunes, it took us all day to do 10 miles. You've got to be careful that you don't go over the top before you know what the other side is like, because you could have got into a sort of sand pit of loose sand which you wouldn't have got the car out of. But going down, you want to keep a car very straight, and then just you get near the bottom, you accelerate, and with luck, get out.
Tom and Gail are beginning to realize the expedition is going to be even tougher than they imagined. But hard as it is in four-wheel drives, on foot, the 400-mile journey to Siwa must have been a nightmare for the Persians. Could Cambyses really have risked losing an army just to attack a small oasis and its oracle? It seems a crazy decision.
Cambyses has the reputation in Herodotus' account of not only being a stereotypical tyrant, but also being drunk and mad. He even tells a story, which I think we have to take with a pinch of salt, which is that the Persians, when they're making decisions, have to think something's a good idea both when they're drunk and when they're sober. I suppose in the Greeks' eyes, you could say that Cambyses' attack on Siwa was a decision that he only thought was a good idea when he was drunk. Perhaps he ought to wait until the morning.
Whatever Cambyses' reasoning, he sent his men to their deaths. The early explorers gave the name the Church of the Spirits of the Lost Persian Army to this rock. When the wind blew, the explorers fancied they heard it keen a lament, bemoaning the folly of sending out men into the land of the dead.
As they retreat further and further from water, I'm sure that the will of the men was beginning to break. What were once men who would march and step and fife and play drums and sing and talk, after a few days they'd be muted and they'd realize the grim circumstance. No more jollity. And they're going also into an area that's reputed to be full of ghosts.
As the Persians headed west into the unknown and a certain death, the scribes of conquered Egypt invoked the gods in all their elemental power. Open are the double doors of the horizon, unlocked are its bolts. Clouds darken the sky, the stars rain down, the constellations stagger, the bones of the hellhounds tremble.